to South Dakota roughly 5 years ago. It marked the first time I'd ever lived by myself, and to be honest, it should have happened much sooner. My parents had spent years pushing me to move out, and eventually I gave in. I've never been particularly outgoing, so the thought of living somewhere isolated actually sounded ideal. The place I settled on sat in one of the snow-heavier regions of the state, hidden on a wide stretch of land where the nearest house was a decent walk away. I didn't mind that at all. For the most part, that's exactly the life I ended up with. The first few years passed quietly, in the best possible sense. I kept to my routine, went to work, came home, stayed to myself, and didn't interfere with anyone else. I never bothered introducing myself to the neighbors, partly because that's not really who I am, and partly because there was no real need. The properties out there are so far apart that you can easily go weeks without crossing paths with another person. That all changed one afternoon in early February. I was still at work when the snow began falling. At first, it seemed ordinary enough, but within an hour it turned into something far more serious. The wind intensified, visibility dropped to almost zero, and the roads quickly became hazardous. Eventually, my boss sent everyone home before the situation worsened. I drive a lifted truck, so I wasn't overly concerned about getting back. I've handled plenty of severe weather before, and the truck has always done just fine. Still, there were a few stretches of the drive that made me uneasy. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I felt nothing but relief. That feeling didn't last. When I went to unlock my front door, I realized it was frozen shut. I stood there for a moment, trying to process it, then tried again, but it wouldn't move. I didn't have a lighter or anything else that could produce enough heat to loosen it. I tried breathing on the lock, warming it with my hands, even hitting it a few times out of frustration. Nothing worked. I went back to my truck and sat there, unsure of what to do next. The heater was running full blast, and I told myself I could just wait out the storm. Maybe it would ease up in an hour or two, and I could deal with it then. But as I watched through the windshield, the snow only grew heavier. After about 10 minutes, it hit me that waiting was a bad idea. The longer I stayed put, the worse it would become. My truck was already half buried, and even with the lift, I doubted I'd be able to get back out. Driving away was no longer an option. I had no one to call. I didn't know my neighbors, and my parents lived hours away. I tried moving the truck anyway, but just as I feared, it was stuck. That left only one real choice: walk to one of the nearby houses and ask for help. I hated the idea of knocking on a stranger's door and asking to be taken in, but there was no alternative. Spending the night in my truck wasn't possible. Eventually, the gas would run out, and I'd be trapped in a freezing metal shell in the middle of a blizzard. The closest house was still a long way off, probably around a quarter mile. By the time I reached it, my body was shaking uncontrollably from the cold. It was a small, single-story house, and even through the blowing snow, I could tell it wasn't in great condition. I knocked on the front door as hard as I could. I waited for about a minute, and I was just about to give up and move on to the next place when the door flew open so suddenly that I stepped back. The man who stood there looked to be around 50, with a face that was completely forgettable. He stared at me briefly without speaking, then introduced himself as Joe. I explained what had happened, and he slowly nodded before stepping aside and letting me in. I should have felt relieved, but something about him immediately felt wrong. I couldn't quite explain it at first. The house was warm, which mattered more than anything in that moment. He offered me a spot on the couch and sat opposite me in a battered armchair. I tried making small talk for a few minutes. He answered when spoken to, but his attention was clearly elsewhere. His eyes kept jumping around the room, from me to the floor, to the ceiling, then over his shoulder. It was as if he couldn't concentrate on anything for more than a few seconds. At first, I assumed he might be uncomfortable, having a stranger in his home, which would have made sense. But the longer I sat there, the more uneasy I felt. He struggled to stay engaged in the conversation. He would stop mid-sentence and stare at a spot on the wall, as if he were looking straight through it. I decided then that I wanted as little interaction with him as possible. I told him I was exhausted and asked if I could get some sleep. He seemed almost relieved by that and gestured toward the couch, telling me I could sleep there. I asked if we could turn off the light, and he switched off the lamp without hesitation. But he didn't leave. He stood in the doorway for what felt like an entire minute, completely still and silent. I lay on the couch with my eyes half shut, pretending to drift off. Eventually, after that long, tense pause, he finally walked down the hallway toward what I assumed was his bedroom. I genuinely tried to sleep. I was worn out, and the couch was more comfortable than I expected. Still, I couldn't get rid of the sense that something was very wrong. Every time I closed my eyes and started to drift, I'd jolt awake, convinced I'd heard something. About an hour later, I actually did hear something. It took a moment to realize that the dull, thumping and scraping noises were coming from above me. At first, I told myself it was just snow, shifting on the roof, which happens during heavy storms. But these sounds felt different. That didn't make sense, though. The house was only one story. There was no upstairs for anyone to be walking around. I stared at the ceiling, trying to force myself to believe there was a logical explanation. The noises went on for several minutes, irregular, but constant. Then, without any warning, there was a single thud that was far louder than the rest. It was so abrupt and violent that I shot upright on the couch. As soon as I did, I saw him. Joe was standing in the doorway again. He must have been there for a while, watching me in the dark, because I never heard him approach. My skin began to crawl. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could say anything, he rushed me. He vaulted over the back of the couch and slammed me to the floor. The next few seconds were absolute chaos. We struggled on the carpet, and I realized he was trying to lock his arm around my neck. He was much stronger than he looked, and for a brief moment, I thought I wouldn't be able to break free. I fought back as hard as I could, and he started shouting. He yelled at me to stop resisting. He kept talking about her, like I was supposed to understand what he meant. He said she was lonely, and mentioned something about me being good company for her. None of that mattered to me. I was fighting to stay alive. I finally managed to get enough leverage to shove him away. I jumped to my feet, grabbed my coat, and bolted for the front door. I didn't even stop to put it on. I was too scared to slow down for even a second. Behind me, I heard him scream something. I'm fairly certain he said, "She's not going to be happy," or something equally insane. I ran and didn't stop until I reached the next house. The people who answered the door were normal, a husband and wife, from what I could tell. They barely glanced at me before pulling me indoors without a single question. I spent that night sleeping on their couch. When morning came, I woke to the wife, who told me her name was Kathy, brewing coffee for everyone. We all sat together at the kitchen table, and I explained everything that had happened. The moment I described the house, the husband, Brandon, cut me off. He asked if the man's name was Joe. When I said yes, he simply nodded, completely unsurprised. He explained that Joe had been known as a trouble in the area for years, but then he shared something that made my skin crawl all over again. Nearly 10 years earlier, Joe's wife had vanished. There was never a formal investigation. No evidence was ever uncovered, but most locals believed he had killed her. Her body was never found. The realization clicked instantly. Yet for some reason I stayed quiet. To this day, I don't understand why I didn't say anything. I did report what happened to the police, but I don't think they ever followed up in any meaningful way. The most unsettling part is that I still live in that same house 3 years later. Nothing has happened since that blizzard night, but I'd be lying if I said I don't feel uneasy every time I drive past Joe's place. The only positive thing to come from all of this is that I became close with the family who helped me that night. Still, every time I visit them, I get an uncomfortable feeling because it brings back thoughts of Joe and whatever horrific thing he did to his wife. This all happened last winter during one of the worst snowstorms I can remember. I'm 27 and live alone in a small rented house in upstate New York. I work remotely in finance, which sounds more impressive than it really is. Most days, I sit at my desk staring at spreadsheets for hours. Because of that, I don't often need to leave the house during the week. Sometimes, I won't go out at all. For days leading up to the storm, the local news had been warning everyone nonstop. You know how it goes. Every storm is labeled historic or deadly until it drops a few inches and people forget about it. But this one genuinely seemed bad. Alerts warned people to stay off the roads unless absolutely necessary and to stock up on supplies. So that morning, I went grocery shopping and bought enough food to last the weekend, then settled in, expecting a dull few days working from home. The snow began in the middle of the afternoon, and by about 8 p.m., I could barely see beyond my front porch. I spent the evening on my couch, half watching TV and half listening to the wind scream outside. Blizzard wind has a specific sound, not like summer storms that come and go. This was nonstop, like the house was trapped inside a tunnel. Around 10:30, I heard something different. A loud thump, followed by a dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across wood. I assumed a tree branch had fallen. There are several old oak trees near my driveway, and with that much snow and wind, it made sense. About 15 minutes later, though, I heard a car horn. It wasn't a normal honk. It was faint and uneven, like someone had pressed it accidentally. I went to the front window and looked outside. A vehicle was stopped near the end of my driveway. I could see headlights cutting through the snow, but not much else. I stood there for a few minutes, waiting to see movement, but nothing happened. With the storm raging, I couldn't even tell what type of car it was. I assumed someone had slid off the road. It happens out there, especially in weather like that. As bad as it sounds, I wasn't about to walk out into a blizzard to help a stranger, not when I could barely see 10 feet ahead. I returned to the couch and tried to distract myself. Around 11 o'clock, there was a knock at my front door. I didn't open it. Instead, I approached and called out, asking who was there. A man answered, saying his car was stuck and that he needed to come inside to warm up and use a phone. His voice sounded strained, like he was struggling to breathe. Part of me felt guilty. If he really had been walking through that storm, he must have been freezing. But another part of me wasn't ready to open my door to a stranger late at night. I cracked the door instead, keeping the security chain fastened. The man standing there was covered in snow, to an almost ridiculous degree. It clung to his jacket, shoulders, and hair. He was shorter than me and visibly shaking. He said his phone was dead and that he'd been walking for a while looking for a house with lights on. I was about to open the door further when I noticed his boots. I don't know why I looked, but I did, and that's when I realized They were clean, completely dry, and spotless. If he'd really been trudging through a blizzard, his boots should have been coated in snow and ice. Mine look worse just walking to my car. A cold feeling settled deep in my stomach. I told him again that I would call for help and make sure someone came for him. This time, he asked to be let in more forcefully. I didn't answer. I shut the door and locked it. I heard him mutter something on the other side as I walked away to grab my phone. I called 911 and explained everything. While speaking to the operator, I heard footsteps move from my porch toward the side of the house and around back. She told me to stay inside and lock all doors, warning that police response might be delayed due to the storm. I went to a side window and peeked out, careful not to be seen. The man stood near the corner of my house, about 15 feet away. He wasn't moving, just staring up at the windows. A few minutes later, pounding started on my back door, like someone trying to force it open. The door rattled violently in its frame. I grabbed a kitchen knife and retreated to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. I stood there, frozen, several feet from the door. The banging stopped after about a minute. I don't know how long I stayed there. It felt like hours, but was probably closer to 20 minutes. Eventually, I heard the car horn again, the same one from before, but this time it was a single, long blast. Not long after, the police finally arrived. They found a vehicle half buried in a snowbank, farther down the road than where I'd seen the headlights earlier. The engine was cold, not warm, like it would have been if someone had recently driven it. Here's the part that still haunts me. The officers told me there were no footprints between the car and my house. The snow in that area was untouched. There were footprints on my driveway and around my house, but they stopped at the driveway as if someone had arrived in a different vehicle. Police searched the area but found no one. The next morning, after the storm cleared and the sun came out, I went outside to look around. That's when I saw muddy handprints on the outside of my bedroom window. Handprints that definitely weren't there when the police checked the property. It was as if whoever it was had returned after they left, or had never gone away at all. A few days later, I learned that another house, about half a mile away, had been broken into during the storm. No one was home, so nobody was hurt, but nothing was stolen. Whoever broke in took nothing. I can't understand why someone would risk breaking into a house during a blizzard without stealing a thing. It feels like robbery was never the goal. I know the whole experience might not sound terrifying, but I can't shake the feeling that whoever tried to get into my house, and likely the same person who entered the other one, was there for something far worse. I'm just grateful I never opened that door. This took place quite a few years back. I've only shared it with maybe 3 people in total. My wife, my brother, and one close friend who I trusted wouldn't assume I'd lost my sanity. I'm sharing it here because I still don't have a clear answer. And honestly, I've come to terms with the fact that I probably never will. I'm 34 years old and live in British Columbia. Throughout most of my 20s, I worked as a professional skier, mainly alpine racing. I competed at a national level for around 6 years before my body started signaling that it was time to walk away. There wasn't some big career-ending accident or anything like that, just the gradual toll that builds up when you've been hurling yourself down mountains since childhood. I stepped away from competition at 26, which felt like the right decision then, and still does now. But leaving competitive skiing doesn't mean you quit skiing altogether. If anything, it gave me the freedom to focus on the type of skiing I truly loved. backcountry routes, far from resorts and crowds. I'm not saying this to boast, but to make it clear that I knew what I was doing out there. I was avalanche trained, certified in wilderness first aid, and well versed in every safety protocol meant for solo travel in remote terrain. I'd completed dozens of solo backcountry trips without any problems. The plan that day was straightforward. I was heading to a remote mountain range a few hours north of my home, a place I'd skied before. The forecast called for light snow, maybe a few inches, nothing that would stop a day trip. I checked avalanche reports the night before and again that morning. Everything seemed reasonable. I reached the mountain just after sunrise, geared up, and began skinning uphill. The snowfall started to intensify during the climb, which wasn't unusual, but the wind shifted as well. It was blowing from a different direction than predicted and was much stronger than expected. Visibility was also dropping far faster than I was comfortable with. The smart decision would have been to turn back immediately, but I was already standing at the top of a line I'd been excited about all week. I told myself I'd do just one run and head out early. I've replayed that choice 1,000 times since. And yes, before you say it, I know it was stupid. I know experienced people die in the backcountry all the time after making the exact kind of decision I made that day. I knew it then too, but I still went through with it. The descent started out fine. The slope was manageable, and I skied cautiously to be extra careful. About 2/3 of the way down, though, the worst possible thing happened. If you've never been caught in an avalanche, it's hard to explain how sudden it is. One moment you're in control, the next you're not. It's nothing like wiping out or catching an edge. The snow starts moving, and you move with it, whether you want to or not. I was lucky. The avalanche wasn't huge, probably a class 2, strong enough to knock me off my skis, but not enough to bury me. I tumbled maybe 30 or 40 yards before slamming into something solid. Slamming as in an immediate stop. I still don't know what I hit. Probably rocks, or maybe a tree buried under the snowpack. All I remember in that moment was the sensation in my left leg. I lay there trying to convince myself that I was okay. But I wasn't. My skis had released, which was good. That's what they're designed to do. But one of them had slid farther downhill, and I had no idea where it ended up. I tried to stand and collapsed instantly. The pain in my leg was beyond anything I'd ever felt. I can't even put it into words. I managed to sit up and assess my situation. The snowfall was still intensifying, which meant I was likely at the beginning of a full-blown blizzard. But the biggest problem was my leg. I couldn't put much weight on it, meaning I couldn't ski out even if I recovered my other ski. My options were limited. I had 3 choices. 2 of them were basically suicide, and the third wasn't much better. I could stay where I was and hope someone came looking for me, but only one person knew my plan that day, and he wouldn't assume anything was wrong for hours. I could dig in and try to wait out the storm, but I didn't have overnight supplies, and the temperature was dropping. Or I could start moving, slowly and painfully, trying to cover as much distance as possible before the conditions became even worse. I chose to move. It wasn't like there was a better option. I secured the remaining gear and began limping downhill, using the one ski pole that was somehow still in my hand as a crude crutch. Every step sent agony through my leg, but stopping wasn't an option. As for the snow, my instincts were right. It kept getting worse, and soon it was coming down so hard I could barely see. I focused on ignoring the pain, forcing myself to move as quickly as I could, wondering if I was going to die out there, when I heard something behind me. At first, I thought the adrenaline was finally breaking my mind. My first thought was that I was becoming delirious in my final moments before blacking out. But I turned around anyway, and what I saw confirmed that something was wrong. There was another skier coming downhill toward me. I can't properly describe it, but seeing him emerge from the snow filled me with a feeling I don't have a name for. I questioned whether what I was seeing was real, feeling relief and fear at the same time, not just because someone else was there, but because of something else I couldn't place. It was fear, but I didn't know of what. He reached me within minutes. He was alone and outfitted for backcountry travel, just like I was. He removed his helmet to adjust his goggles and asked if I was injured. I told him what had happened. Without hesitation, he stepped in close and let me put my arm over his shoulder. We started moving together. Like I said, there was a feeling I couldn't explain, something beyond adrenaline, pain, relief, or confusion. It didn't feel like a random encounter. It felt like he hadn't found me by accident, as crazy as that sounds. We talked about simple things, most of which I don't remember. But there was one thing he said that stuck with me. He told me he hadn't used his legs in a long time, and that it felt good to be back on solid ground. I didn't really understand what he meant. I assumed it was some ski slang I wasn't familiar with. I laughed, and we kept going. At one point, I had to stop. I remember that moment clearly. I leaned against a tree and closed my eyes for maybe 4 seconds. When I opened them, he was gone. There was no one there. And unless he'd somehow buried himself in the snow, there was nowhere he could have gone. I called out to him. What else could I do? No one answered. I searched the nearby snow, thinking maybe he'd been buried. Nothing. Then it got worse. There were no tracks in the snow, except my own. I started to panic. He'd been right there, supporting half my weight for what felt like an hour, and yet there was nothing. I felt dizzy, like I'd been punched in the stomach, and that strange feeling from earlier returned. The logical part of my mind insisted there had to be an explanation. Maybe I was more disoriented than I realized. Maybe the snow had filled in his tracks faster than mine. Or maybe I'd imagined the entire thing. Maybe I was already dead. There wasn't time to figure it out. The storm wasn't going to wait for me to make sense of it. I don't know how I made it back to my car. The final mile was a blur. Just pain, cold, and pure stubbornness. But I did make it. I drove myself to the hospital and finally heard some good news. The doctor said my leg was badly sprained, but not broken. They told me I was incredibly lucky. A few days later, I was recovering at home. But I couldn't stop thinking about one thing. That other skier. Where he came from, where he went, and why there were no tracks. I kept telling myself I'd eventually figure it out. But that was probably wishful thinking. I was browsing a local ski-focused website, something I do often, when I came across something terrifying. It was an article about a fatal backcountry skiing incident. A man who'd gone missing in a storm weeks earlier. It happened in the same mountain range, and authorities had never recovered a body. The worst was assumed. There were no photos of the man in the article, and when I searched his name, I couldn't find any social media profiles. So I can't compare the man I saw on the mountain to the one in the article. But the coincidence is still unsettling. I choose to believe that shock and hypothermia caused me to hallucinate, that my mind played tricks on me. Maybe my brain created something to convince me I wasn't alone. But I remember his shoulder under my arm. I remember him helping me down the mountain. There's no way I could have moved that fast alone. I still ski, but I never go alone anymore. I still don't know what helped me off that mountain.